Hello everyone and welcome back to another video, and my first Halloween special. We're going to be looking at the evolution of vampires in movies, how they went from this to this. I hope you've had a great October so far, and I hope you have a happy Halloween.
How far are you willing to go, Michael?
Vampires have changed a lot over the years. Their strengths, weaknesses, appearance, curse or virus, and more. Vampires have been a part of movies since the silent era. The very first vampire I think almost everyone knows about is Nosferatu, also known as Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck. This film came out in Germany in 1922 and is known as the first feature-length vampire film and is still praised today for its creativity. The vampire's look was based on the hideous creatures of European folklore. 2022 was the film's 100-year anniversary. Crazy. Nosferatu was actually an unofficial, unlicensed adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. Copyright on movies was probably a little muddy in the 1920s, so they just changed the name from Count Dracula to Count Orlok, and then changed a few other names and story details. But for all intents and purposes, the story is pretty similar to the original Dracula. There was apparently another vampire film called Dracula's Death that came out in 1921, 1 year before Nosferatu. This was a Hungarian silent film, and like many others of its time, it's considered lost. Guess what though? There's an even older silent film that features a vampire. It's a short film though, 38 minutes long. It's called The Vampire from 1913. The vampire was a woman, also known as femme fatale. Dracula is by far the most popular vampire of all time. He first appeared in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel titled Dracula. There has been over 175 film adaptations of Dracula. First would be Dracula's Death, but it's a lost film. There's also been some debate on whether or not it was based on Bram Stoker's novel or not, which seems weird because it's named Dracula. Since most vampires are based on Bram Stoker's novel in some way or another, where did he get the idea? Well, most people know that the original version of Dracula was based on the historical figure Vlad Tepes, a ruler of Wallachia in the 15th century. As far as the supernatural abilities go, some people think that Stoker may have possibly also partially based Dracula off the Abertak, a vampiric creature from Irish folklore. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but unlike the vampires of Eastern European folklore, which are shown as hideous creatures, Dracula is suave and charismatic. The original Dracula was as fast and strong as 20 men. He can climb walls like a spider and see in complete darkness. He can alter his appearance, change his size to an unknown amount, transform into all kinds of animals like wolves, bats, dogs, rats, and more. He can also turn into a mist and elemental dust in the moonlight. He can also control the weather and control certain animals and corpses, and mesmerize people with eye contact. As you can see, a lot of the typical vampire strengths and abilities were established very early. But what about weaknesses? Well, Dracula and other vampires in the 1897 novel would be repelled with a cross or garlic. Sunlight does not harm Dracula, but it weakens him to an almost normal level, and Dracula cannot use his magical abilities like shapeshifting during the day. He needs to be invited inside, and cannot cross running water, and he must rest on the soil of his place of birth. This means where you were turned. Vampires can be killed by being immersed in running water, fire, shot with a sanctified bullet, beheaded, or pierced in the heart with a stake. What is the most common, but something not included in most Dracula adaptations, is the fact that iron stakes would also work. This is a reference to myths that say that iron harms the supernatural. So most of the weaknesses were also established right off the bat. Of course, one big change was sunlight. Sunlight did not burn vampires originally. So what movie established this idea? It was actually Nosferatu. This was the first film to depict a vampire being killed by sunlight, and it started to gain traction after that. It's a great way to give an extremely menacing and strong villain a weakness. It's worth noting that Nosferatu didn't catch fire from the sun though. He just disappeared. I would say the next big step in vampire cinema was Universal's Dracula from 1931, starring Bela Lugosi. This Dracula was also not burned by sunlight. This film was an adaptation of the stage play based on Bram Stoker's novel. Lugosi's performance of Dracula was so iconic that a lot of his mannerisms and way of speaking became signatures of the character.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
They did make a direct sequel called Dracula's Daughter in 1936 and another sequel, Son of Dracula, in 1943. Dracula was supposed to be dead after his 1931 film, but returned to appear in House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Okay, they were running out of ideas. In 1958, Christopher Lee played Count Dracula in the new reboot in the Hammer film series. This, next to Nosferatu and Bela Lugosi, is up there with the most iconic Draculas. This movie had a great scene with Dracula being killed by sunlight. This cemented being killed by sunlight as the go-to weakness and would be common in almost every movie after this. Christopher Lee went on to portray Dracula in 5 of the 7 sequels in this series. This is definitely the longest running Dracula series. The reason Christopher Lee's character in Star Wars was named Count Dooku was because it was an homage to his role as Count Dracula. In 1979, there was a remake of the Nosferatu movie. This one was called Nosferatu the Vampire. It was an adaptation that used plot points from Nosferatu as well as the original Dracula. This film has a cult following and has received great reviews. Stephen King's Salem's Lot from 1979 depicted vampires a little differently. It showed them as unintelligent, terrifying creatures with no sexual appeal like most vampires had. Their only desire was to feed on blood. The 1980s was a bit of a vampire renaissance. Horror movies were beginning to be taken more seriously and were performing well in the box office. This decade brought us such classics as The Lost Boys. Vampire horror meets The Goonies meets Love Story. Kiefer Sutherland's performance as the vampire David will always be one of my favorite. The 80s seemed to be when vampires went from spooky guys in castles or monsters to bad boys and criminals. I think Fright Night is an underappreciated movie, to be honest. I don't hear it get talked about as much as The Lost Boys, but it definitely should. And the same goes for Near Dark with Bill Paxton. It's a much grittier look at vampires. A lot of people think the reason Near Dark didn't get the praise it deserved was because it was overshadowed by The Lost Boys, which came out the same year. 1985 was the year Vampire Hunter D came out, possibly the first ever anime to feature vampires. The screenplay is based on the first light novel in the long-running Vampire Hunter D series. This series has a huge cult following and it's well deserved.
Welcome to my home.
Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992 was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. This is often regarded as the most faithful adaptation to Bram Stoker's novel, except for Keanu's accent.
Count Dracula.
Dracula is the medieval ruler Vlad Tepes, better known as Vlad the Impaler for his choice of displaying his enemies' corpses. The movie stars Gary Oldman as Count Dracula, Winona Ryder as Mina Harker, Anthony Hopkins as Professor Abraham Van Helsing, and Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker. If somehow you haven't seen this movie, please check it out. Just 2 years after Francis Ford Coppola's take on the Bram Stoker novel, vampires would be changed forever. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire from 1994. The film was based on Anne Rice's novel from 1976 with the same title. It's part of her Vampire Chronicles series. I've done a video before about both Vampire Chronicles movies if you're interested. The film is regarded as not being an exact adaptation of the book, but the screenplay was written by Anne Rice herself, which is why Interview with the Vampire is considered the best of the Vampire Chronicles movies. There's a new TV show based on this story as well, now airing on AMC. 4 years later was the introduction of what you can call action vampires. Vampires with James Woods, and the first Blade movie was released in 1998. Blade was Marvel's first comic book hero movie, and it was a huge success that kicked off what we have today. A mess. Just kidding. Blade is one of my all-time favorite movies in general, not just vampires. The action, the lore, the comedy, the cast, all perfect. This is another movie with the stars aligned. This was probably not the first movie to have half vampires, but it sure made it a lot more popular. Blade is a Dhampir, also known as a half vampire because his mother was bit while she was pregnant with him. This gave Blade most of the unique abilities that vampires possess, but with none of the drawbacks. The Blade series showed a different take on vampires than the previous films of this decade. In 6 years, we went from Bram Stoker's Dracula to Blade. It was also around this time the vampire movies started to tackle the idea of their creation in different ways. Instead of a curse, in Blade, the vampires were created by the ancient blood god Le Magre.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
The 2000s brought a lot of good vampire movies. Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman, Daybreakers, Night Watch, and don't forget the beginning of the Underworld series and one of the best action leads ever, Kate Beckinsale as Celine. Underworld took a much different approach to vampirism than most stories. Instead of being based on a supernatural curse, the vampires came from a biological virus. When the plague wiped out a village in Hungary, one man's body was affected differently. The virus changed inside him and he became the first immortal. Later, his two sons were bitten by a rabid wolf and a bat. Their genes were already unstable from their father's virus, and the animal bites caused them to become the first vampire and werewolf. One of the creators of Underworld, Kevin Greavius, used to be a scientist, so he wanted the virus to have a basis in reality. I think the idea was pretty cool and it made the series feel more unique. Some other shows and movies also started to follow this idea of vampirism being of biological origin rather than supernatural. Kate Beckinsale said she always wanted to do an Underworld and Blade mashup, which would have been awesome. By this time, people were making all kinds of different vampires, so you never really knew what to expect. Some older vampire movies depicted them as immortal with a curse, and never aging, but some vampire movies take a different approach and have them age much slower rather than not at all. Some vampires, like the ones in Blade, are not weak to garlic, holy water, or crosses, removing them from the curse or religious aspect and just making them more of a separate species, not inherently evil. The 2000s brought some really unique vampire films in the form of horror. 30 Days of Night is one of my personal favorite vampire horror films, and most of that comes down to the menacing demeanor of the vampires and their monstrous look. Unlike a lot of vampire movies and shows, you don't want to be these vampires, and you definitely don't want to meet them. They're not romanticized at all, which I'm a big fan of. The basic story of this movie is the small town of Barrow, Alaska is the hunting grounds for a group of vampires. They travel there once a year because it experiences something called a polar night, which is when the sun doesn't come up for 30 days. Pretty good for a vampire. Alaska can also suffer from long bouts of the sun not setting though too, so it's like heaven for vampires sometimes and hell for them at other times. Let the Right One In is possibly one of the most unique vampire films in existence. It's a Swedish horror film based on the novel of the same name by Jean Elvita Lindqvist. The movie received unprecedented critical acclaim and fans loved it as well. Roger Ebert said it takes vampires as seriously as Nosferatu, which is a great way to put it. There's no campiness here or playing into stereotypes, just cold-blooded murder. Ebert also said Let the Right One In is the best modern vampire film. I don't like saying that one movie is the best, but it's hands down one of the best for sure. The story is about a kid named Oscar who fantasizes about killing his bullies and meeting a 200-year-old vampire stuck in the body of a child. My favorite thing to think about when it comes to this movie was, did Ellie really love Oscar or not? If you don't know what I mean, you should definitely go watch this movie if you haven't. There's also an American remake called Let Me In that people also said is pretty good, just not quite as faithful to the novel. Now we're into the 2010s. We were talking about movies, but I won't be able to help myself from mentioning a few TV shows from this decade because there's some really good ones. One of my favorite vampire movies from this time is actually a Dracula film, Dracula Untold. What was supposed to be the beginning of the Dark Universe and the Master Vampire and Vlad appearing in other movies, like a Marvel team-up but Universal Monster style. Would have been so cool, but unfortunately, it was cancelled. This movie wasn't loved by critics, but it was widely praised by fans, and it won a poll I made asking, what's your favorite Dracula movie? It's strange to me that critics seem to hate this movie and fans love it, but that's bound to happen sometimes. Luke Evans was perfect as Vlad, and so was Charles Dance as the Master Vampire. Charles also played a vampire elder in the Underworld series. In Dracula Untold, Vlad makes a deal with an evil creature on the mountain so that he may save his son and his people. The creature itself made a deal with a demon long ago, but it was tricked, and that's why he's now trapped in the mountain, until Vlad came. I thought this new take on the Dracula story was pretty entertaining. In 2011, there was a remake of the 1985 Fright Night movie. It was a great remake that made some really cool changes to the inner workings of the vampires and introduced the idea of there being vampire tribes, as in different species of vampires. The movie was pretty successful, so I'm surprised they never tried to remake The Lost Boys or Near Dark. I'm glad they didn't, I'm just surprised they didn't try. A surprisingly good movie from this era is Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, and also Priest with Paul Bettany and Carl Urban. Priest also took a totally different approach to vampires, making them a separate species that evolved underground rather than any kind of curse or virus spread to humans. The 2010s also started to stray into more unique vampire comedies as well, rather than just spoof movies. Movies like Dark Shadows with Johnny Depp and What We Do in the Shadows. What We Do in the Shadows started with a movie and it also got a TV show. It's a mockumentary horror comedy starring some different vampires that live in a flat together. I've only seen a little bit of this show myself, but it's always nice to see someone try and do something different with vampires. There's been a lot of great vampire TV shows to come out, and a couple of my favorites are The Strain, Midnight Mass, and Penny Dreadful. All these shows have something in common: vampires being related to angels or God himself. I'm not exactly sure when this trend started, but I find it interesting that something traditionally seen as evil is now being made synonymous with angels in heaven. In the show The Strain, the archangel Azrael grew bloodthirsty and was punished by God. This angel's buried remains is what leads to the existence of vampires. In Midnight Mass, it was questioned whether vampires are angels, or if angels never existed at all and were actually vampires all along. Vampires have always been tied to religious symbols like the cross, so maybe it was inevitable that people would interpret their connection to religion differently. Some movies and shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer say vampires are human bodies inhabited by demons. The show Penny Dreadful from 2013 goes another direction. It takes the story of the war in heaven and puts a spin on it. Instead of Lucifer being cast to hell after failing to overthrow God, Lucifer and his brother Dracula are cast out together. One brother sent to hell to exist as a spirit, the other sent to earth to exist in the flesh. One to feed off the souls of the dead, the other to feed on the blood of the living. I'm not heavily religious or anything, but for some reason shows and movies that take this angle seem to really interest me. And if they interest you too, I have made full videos on The Strain, Midnight Mass, and Penny Dreadful. It's crazy to think about how many different ways the story of Dracula has been interpreted and changed by so many people. He's been a nobleman, a warrior, a fallen angel, a man who made a deal with the devil, and a guy with a dad bod. If only Bram Stoker could have known what he started. So where does that leave us today? Well, there's still good vampire movies being made. It's not a super serious movie, but I enjoyed Vampires in the Bronx. Some kids protect their neighborhood from a group of vampires trying to take over. Not overly complicated, but it's really entertaining. The Netflix movie Blood Red Sky was one of the best vampire horror movies I have seen, and it had some really unique qualities. My favorite part of the movie is probably the setting. Heard of snakes on a plane? Well, what about vampires on a plane? It makes for some really tense situations, and there's some really interesting mysteries about where the vampire virus came from. The BBC and Netflix Dracula that came out in 2020 was one of the best depictions of Dracula ever, minus the last episode. It's a 3-part miniseries based in different locations and follows Dracula as he travels to what he calls the New World. It proves that a good story is still worth retelling if it's done right. Day Shift with Jamie Foxx and Dave Franco is pretty good. You can never go wrong with Snoop Dogg, and the movie started to establish some deeper lore with the different vampire species. But I do have one question. What was with the guy pissing his pants every 2 seconds? It wasn't even that funny, at least not for me. Take that part out of the movie and I would raise it from a 5.5 out of 10 to at least a 6 out of 10. Also, the action scenes in Day Shift are really good. The co-screenwriter of the movie, Shay Hatton, also co-wrote John Wick Chapter 3 and the upcoming John Wick Chapter 4. Currently, AMC is airing the new TV show Interview with the Vampire. It's received mixed reviews so far, but it's hard to say if that's because it's not good or because people are just too attached to the original story to accept any changes to characters they're so close to. So far, I think the changes that they have made put an interesting spin on a story we already know. I found the show entertaining so far, but like I said, we'll have to see where it goes. Of course, I can't forget Morbius. It's really a shame that Morbius dropped the ball. Having him not drink human blood was a weird decision, and so was everything else, to be honest. I only hope that they can pull themselves together for Blade, because without the success of the first Blade movie, who knows if Marvel movies would be where they are today. I mean, they probably would be, but still, Blade started it all. He deserves a great movie. I think the new actor is a good choice, but Blade will always be Wesley Snipes for me. The original Dracula could turn into a wolf and control wolves. When Bela Lugosi says children of the night, he's talking about wolves. It was pretty common for a vampire to take the shape of a canine, but I noticed that you see this less and less. Possibly for movies to more easily separate vampires and werewolves. The things that have remained the most consistent in vampire lore, I think, is their fangs. From Nosferatu to Vampire Diaries, fangs have always stayed. And being staked in the heart as well. It doesn't always have to be a stake made of wood, but just being stabbed in the heart in general. And of course, sunlight. There's been very few vampires that shed this all-important trope. How someone can become a vampire has changed in many ways too. It can vary from being bitten to having to drink the vampire's blood, worms like in The Strain, or a curse. One of my favorite parts of every vampire show is finding out where they came from. Vampire stories and movies are still changing and evolving. They've definitely come a long way from where they've started. But without Bram Stoker and these classics, we never would have got the movies that define the genre today. Like I mentioned earlier, look at the difference just from the beginning of the 90s to the end of the 90s. Then from there, people started to go all different directions. Vampire movies were always one of my favorite genres because it provides a unique lens to view stories through. The simplest of stories becomes more interesting when you add murder to survive, immortality, and mystery. As far as my favorite vampire movies, it's hard to pick one, so my top 3 would probably be The Lost Boys, 30 Days of Night, and the first Underworld movie. I'm actually really curious to know what you guys would rank as your top 3 vampire movies, so if you want to share, leave them down in the comments. That's my video about how vampire movies have evolved and changed over 100 years. From silent films to What We Do in the Shadows. I hope you enjoyed hearing about all these movies as much as I enjoyed talking about them. Thank you guys so much for the love that you've shown the channel this year. I try to put a lot of work into my videos, so it's great to see when you guys enjoy them. If there's any movies or TV shows you want me to cover, please leave them in the comments below. Also, if you want to just wish me a happy Halloween, you can do that too. If you enjoyed, leave a like. And maybe hit that subscribe button if you haven't. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.